On today's Live Open Daily, there's been a theory floating around the VR community for a very long time that if you just put all the popular flat games in VR, everyone would just flock to VR to play them in virtual reality, because why wouldn't they? Well, we have some numbers on that now, and I remain unconvinced. I'm your host, Live Open Mike. This theory got way more steam when PlayStation VR 2 became a thing, because the idea and the theories floating around, all the rumors were that Sony was going to bring all of their massive IPs to VR. We were going to get The Last of Us in VR, The Last of Us 2, we're going to get all the Horizon games. This was before we knew Horizon Call of the Mountain was coming. Everyone was just convinced that we're going to get all these massive IPs in VR. Spider-Man was another one, because why would they not do a Spider-Man VR game? Insomniac makes those games. Insomniac makes fantastic VR games like Stormland. So it just makes sense to make a Spider-Man VR game, right? Because everyone will just buy a PlayStation VR 2 because all their favorite games are in VR. They're going to want to play in VR because VR is awesome. That's pretty much the theory that was floating around, and it's proven to really not be the case. Today I want to really talk about why, but first let's get into the numbers. Some of this is not going to be an exact science because, one, I'm going to use a couple of horror games as examples of this just because this is the data that's available to us now. And looking at PC VR equivalents, there are a lot of games that have VR modes, but because they don't separate into flat or VR versions, like Madison for instance has a flat version and a VR version that are sold separately, we can't really look at those numbers because all that stuff gets mixed together in terms of like concurrent player counts and things like that. So games like Skyrim and No Man's Sky are very hard to evaluate because we don't have separate data for those. Let's start with Resident Evil 7 on PlayStation VR 1 because this is actually the best success story and the best test case for this. Resident Evil 7 did not get a VR mode for PC VR. It was exclusively paid for by Sony to be a PSVR 1 exclusive, but a timed exclusive. The exclusivity window ran out eventually, but we never got the PC mode, and then looking back at the numbers you can kind of see why. Resident Evil 7 sold about 5 million copies in its first few months of release, and of that number, 750,000 players played on PlayStation VR 1. That's actually a fairly decent attach rate. It's better than the ones we're going to talk about in a minute, but you have to assume that most of the VR players were also going to buy that game anyway, because a lot of VR players will play a game on flat screen. The number of VR players who will only play a game in VR and will not buy a flat screen game, period, I'm going to say is at best 30, maybe 40% of the people who are in VR. A lot of us still play flat screen games, myself included. So if you take that 750,000 and just say 40% of them were only going to buy it if it was in VR, and then just do the quick math on that, you're looking at about 300,000 players who probably bought the game specifically because it was in VR. That's not a huge number when you compare the 5 million, it's actually less than 10%. Which, remember that number, 10%, we're going to talk more about that. Then hop over to Resident Evil Village on PlayStation VR 2. This released with the headset right away. It was already available. Even though Village had come out some years before that, the VR mode launched with the headset along with Horizon Call of the Mountain, Gran Turismo 7, and a bunch of third-party games that were not like VR ports or major IPs. Looking at the date from the Resident Evil portal on Capcom's website, for Resident Evil Village, over 120,000 players have actually played the game in VR. There's not a native VR mode for PC. There is a mod available, but Capcom's obviously not tracking that. And the same goes for Resident Evil 4 Remake. That's about 120,000 players. Again, looking at the portal information on Capcom's website. Both of those numbers are less than 10% of the number of people who actually own PlayStation VR 2s. That is a scary, scary number. That means that that game has a very low attach rate in relation to the number of people who actually buy a game. And that's even scarier when you think about the fact that a lot of people may have already owned Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake because it was available on flat screen. Both of those games were available on flat screen on PlayStation 5 months, if not a year or so ahead of when it was available on PSVR 2. So taking in that fact, and according to Mattel 311, that Sony paid over $5 million for the conversion of these games, each game one by one, that's not a very good return on investment, and it's not an encouraging sign for these hybrid modes. But then take it out of PSVR 2 because that is a fairly limited play base compared to something like PC VR. The next latest example we have is something like Madison VR. The original version of Madison on flat screen had a peak number of 506 players available. Madison VR's peak number is 46. The original Madison has, as I'm looking at it right now, 2,220 reviews currently on Steam. Madison VR has 90. That's a hair over 24-to-1 ratio on reviews and a hair over 10-to-1 on concurrent player counts. Again, these aren't going to be exact numbers, and this is just what we can extrapolate from the data. But the short version is people aren't flocking to play a VR version of a flat game. Again, we don't have numbers for games like No Man's Sky, which has an excellent VR mode, but because that's baked into the main game, we don't have separation between those two. And there are several games like that, like Hitman 3 on PC VR, War Thunder, so on and so forth. So all we can go off of is the games that are separated out. But the real question is, why do we think that's happening? And I think that's a fundamental divide between VR enthusiasts, big fans like myself, who kind of think that VR is the greatest thing ever, which most of us do, and that's perfectly fine to have that opinion, but we're overestimating how much it sells to a new player. When you stick someone new in a virtual reality headset, you are inherently taking away a couple of things that make them very comfortable with AR gaming. Even if they're wearing something very light like a big screen beyond, they're still inherently wearing something on their face to monitor directly up to them, as opposed to staring at a computer monitor or a TV, which is something that people are very used to doing. Number two is also their comfort, but it's them not knowing spatially what's around them. Especially if you're someone who has kids or pets, it's very easy to play a game and still be able to keep track of, what your kids are doing, running around the house, or what your pet's doing, maybe laying next to you, or getting into something they shouldn't be getting into. Once you're in VR, you take that ability away to be able to do that because you're fully immersed in the environment. And while we as VR fans absolutely love that, that is not something that's comfortable for most players, especially to play something that they can play in another medium. And then the last thing is how long they can actually play the game. If you're playing something on your couch or in a comfy gaming chair like the one I'm sitting in right now, that is something you could do for absolute hours on end. But if we're talking about new VR users, people who are going to come into VR for the first time, what's the average you expect someone to stay in VR for the first time? 15 minutes? 30 minutes? Does that work if they're going to play something like a Resident Evil, like a No Man's Sky, like a Skyrim for instance? We'll talk more about Skyrim in a minute. If they're already used to playing those games for hours on end on flat screen, what's the more comfortable experience to them? Not everyone is willing to make the immediate compromise to jump into VR to play the same game they could play on flat screen, and I think that's something that is inherently flawed about the hybrid model. Yes, we may think it's a better experience in VR. Yes, we as fans may think it is a better experience in VR, and most of the time I believe that we're right. But because you're taking away some of those creature comforts, because you're making that player compromise to be able to experience it in VR, how likely is someone who has not played in VR willing to be able to make that sacrifice? Moreover, to take out the cost expense. Because if you don't already own a PlayStation VR 2 because you're not a VR fan, good luck convincing them to shell out $600 to be able to play Resident Evil 4, a game that came out a year ago that they can already play. Even something like Madison or No Man's Sky or Skyrim or countless other games that have VR modes, even if you're buying a Quest 2 for $200, you might need to upgrade your PC to have a VR ready PC for that. My PC when I first got into VR had an RTX 1050 in it, and technically it did meet the minimum specs, but let me tell you, that was not a good experience, and I didn't touch PC VR until I shelled out $1,500 for a PC upgrade. I think the issue at heart of this is that this is still a familiar experience to the player, and there's not enough new there to entice them to be able to get into it unless they can do a demo right away and get into the game right away. But how many PlayStation VR 2 or PC VR demos do you see? I just went to a gaming con a few weeks ago, MomoCon, and there were a ton of VR experiences set up for people. I actually hung around the VR area for a while because I knew some of the guys who were running it, and I would see the people who take the headset off and their reactions were always the same. That was pretty cool. And then they'll ask how much the headset is, and they'll say, oh, the PSVR 2 is $500 or $550, and they'll be like, I don't know if I want to pay that much for that. There were also Valve Indexes there, and they were playing, I think it was Propagation, the original horror wave shooter, not Propagation, Paradise Hotel, and they took off the headset and said the same thing. That was cool. How much is one of these headsets? And the guy goes, oh, a Valve Index is $1,000, and they went, seriously? Like, you could see their eyes go wide, and they really weren't into the idea. As weird as this sounds, I feel like putting a player to something they're familiar with actually works counterintuitive to selling them on VR, because when you think about the experiences that people get into VR for, you hear kind of the same games, namely something like Beat Saber, because that's a very, very unique to VR experience. There's a reason a game like Gorilla Tag is as insanely popular as it is because that is a uniquely VR experience that you cannot replicate on flat screen, nor does it exist anywhere else on flat screen. Beat Saber has the same thing going for it. Whenever I hear of someone, even who owns a Quest, wanting to get into PC VR, one of the first things they want to do is play Half-Life Alyx because they've heard of that game, or they want to play some of the other PC VR classics that they've heard of, like Lone Echo, like Asgard's Wrath. You know what they're not saying? I want to play Madison VR, I want to play No Man's Sky, I want to play Hitman 3. They're not talking about the games that have VR modes that they already have access to because they already have access to it. that's not enough of a selling point to get them to upgrade for that, because they're not getting anything new. And you can spend all the time in the world going through subreddits and Facebook groups or Discords or wherever where people are talking about VR and they're talking about their first VR experiences. It's very, very rare that you'll hear them say that their first VR experience and something that they wanted to play is something they have already played. Once you've already had that experience, the likelihood of you going back to play it again, even in a different medium, is very, very low. There aren't a lot of people who buy games on different consoles because they have graphical upgrades and things like that. Even in this age of remake that we're living in right now, and you look at the number of people who are buying the remakes versus the original versions, the remakes are not selling. The remakes are not outselling the original versions. That goes for The Last of Us, that goes for Resident Evil 4 Remake. Resident Evil 4 sold more copies than that. The original Final Fantasy VII had a higher attach rate and outsold the current version that's out right now, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, because people were looking for new experiences. You have to be a true fan of the original to want to buy that, but even then there's a point of diminishing returns. To be willing to pay hundreds of dollars to replay a game that you've already played on another platform, you have to be a massive fan of that game. So these companies are basically gambling on the fact that new players will want to come in, because not every single player who played the original version of that game will want to play it again, even if it's in virtual reality. There's a point of diminishing returns there that I think we as VR fans don't really take into account. And then there's a financial implication for these developers. Let's take Horizon Forbidden West as an example, just because I have those numbers right in front of me. There was a not small number of players who said that instead of making Horizon Call of the Mountain, Sony should have just translated Horizon Forbidden West or Zero Dawn into VR directly, because that would have sold headsets, again doubling down on the whole hybrid model. Horizon Forbidden West cost $212 million to make, and it sold 8.5 million copies worldwide. Converting a game that large to virtual reality would have cost Sony millions of dollars to do, similar to what they paid Capcom to do the Resident Evil ports. If the Resident Evil ports are only getting about a tenth of the attach rate of the people who own PlayStation VR 2s, you can assume that Horizon probably would have done roughly that same number, again because that's a game that's been out for a very long time and people have already played it. The likelihood of someone playing Horizon in VR that has not played in flat screen, that's a fairly small number of players, so you're going to look at an attach rate probably somewhere around 10%. So when you're looking at player counts in maybe the hundreds of thousands, and a lot of them already will own that game, versus the expenditure of millions of dollars, $3 to $5 million to convert the game to VR, Sony's losing money on that deal. And that's been the case for the hybrid games so far, because again, they're not offering anything new. I think the lone exception to this is Gran Turismo 7, but there's a caveat to that. A lot of people are saying that VR for Gran Turismo 7 is the optimal way to play the game, but all of these people have wheel setups. So now to get the optimal Gran Turismo 7 experience, you are now paying for $550 for the headset itself, plus another $150 to $300 for wheel and pedal. Then you can get the best living version of that game. Most people are going to say, nah, I'm good. I'm not going to pay $700 to $1,000 to play the game in VR when I can comfortably play it from my couch or a gaming chair. That doesn't make sense for them. Now look, I'm a massive VR fan, just like you if you're listening to or watching this podcast. And I do demos for new people in VR all the time. But you know what I'm not sticking them in is something they're already familiar with. I always make it a point to give them something new. I've sold more people in VR by putting them in something like First Steps on the Quest or Beat Saber than I ever have sticking someone in like Resident Evil 4, for instance. I've actually put people who are big Resident Evil fans into Resident Evil 4, and they were like, yeah, that's cool, but I probably won't buy the headset for it. I've already played it. And that's the key line. I've already played it. If it's not new, it doesn't sell as well. The word new actually is a selling tactic in marketing. And even though VR is fresh and new to a lot of people, you're still fundamentally playing the same game. Now this might upset some people, but I think VR could do to go more the route of what we see in, like, let's say the handheld market. There are a lot of franchises out there like Far Cry, like Metal Gear Solid, like Resident Evil, that have taken their games and taken their franchises and created completely separate experiences that can only be played on portable devices. And that gets people to actually buy those portable devices because they're uber fans of the series and they want to play every game possible. The Legend of Zelda is known for this too. There are tons of Zelda games that only exist on portable devices and you can only play them in that medium unless you have emulators and you're pirating a copy of the game, but let's not go there. If you're creating VR experiences that exist in the same universe as franchises people already like the upcoming Batman Arkham Shadows on the Quest, that's more likely to get a fan in to play it because they're going to be experiencing something new and something they haven't played before and something that they can only experience in VR. Half-Life Alyx is another great example of that. If Valve had just remade Half-Life 2 and stuck that into VR, I doubt it has half of the critical acclaim Alyx does, specifically because it's not something new. New will always be a selling point. That's a wrap for this episode. You can catch all my podcasts on YouTube, Spotify, iHeart, and Apple Podcasts. Also catch me on Twitch. I stream VR there several days a week at Live Open Mic. I'll talk to you tomorrow.